And with that, I would love to welcome Deepa Iyer. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to learning from you today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the welcome. It is always a pleasure to be in the midst of Tsuru for Solidarity, an organization I deeply admire. So thank you all for joining on a Sunday. And I was also going to ask Mika if you could send me like a chat when it's getting really close to the Q&A session so that I'm not running behind. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a little bit of information to share. And I also wanted to let you know that some of this, I'm going to be sharing some information to you, and then we will also have an opportunity to go into breakout session as well. And there will be some points where I ask you in the chat to respond, so would love for you to do that also. Okay, so I wanted to actually start by, again, expressing my gratitude to Tsuru for Solidarity for the transformative work that you hold and engage in. This is a few pictures from the trip that Mika referenced when members came to DC, and I was able to meet with them. So gratitude to all of you, and in particular to Mike and to Satsuki for their mentorship and friendship over the years as well. The goals for our session today is I'm going to have an opportunity to share with you a framework and approach that I've developed called the social change ecosystem, and we'll have a chance to hopefully apply that framework to strengthen your individual and organizational work. And this is just a starting point of a conversation. I'm hoping that you will engage more with the workbook and amongst yourselves as well moving forward. So Mika shared a little bit about my background, but I think it's always important to be clear about the points of entry that we have when we come into spaces that are new. So for me, my points of entry into this work and into this space really stem from my experiences as an immigrant. I moved to the state of Kentucky when I was 12 years old from India with my parents. And the experiences of feeling very othered in that time and space shaped how I think about social justice and inclusion. For me, a watershed moment in my life was the 9/11 attacks and what happened afterward in terms of the backlash that targeted my communities. And I will always remember how Japanese American community members were among the first to stand in solidarity with us. And that work that I did for about 15 to 20 years is really what, again, informs and shapes me. It is my home, my community and political home. And so a lot of what you're going to hear today stem from my own personal experiences, as well as my experiences working in community in a time of crisis. So with that, just a little bit about the organization I am helmed at right now, the Building Movement Project. We're a national nonprofit, and we focus on catalyzing social change by other nonprofit organizations and movements. And we do that in three ways. We do a lot of research into the nonprofit sector. You can see some of our reports here. We just released one actually on Asian American organizations, which I'll put into the chat later. We also create and develop a lot of resources like the map that I'm going to be talking about, and we engage in relationship building with organizations through a project that I run called Solidarity Is. So this is a project where we train organizations and individuals on how to engage in transformative solidarity. We do a lot of storytelling on solidarity, and that's where Satsuki has been extremely amazing in sharing her own story through our podcast. And we also bring organizations together, and Mike and others have been part of that through Tsuru in various formations that we support. Okay. So before we get started, I just wanted to put some community agreements out there. I'm not going to go through all of these, but take a moment to look at them and let me know if they resonate with you. But the one that I wanted to highlight is the one that is in purple, that we know that how we do the work is just as important as what the work is. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is the how we do the work, how we come into community, how we develop our own awareness, how we figure out what our shared values are, and the like. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat really quickly to make sure that I am not missing anything. Okay, great. All right, please keep introducing yourselves. Okay, so I wanted to actually start with a check-in question. And again, you can put this into the chat. And the question is, what is the boldest headline you'd like to see when it comes to social justice this year? So it could be like a small phrase that really kind of allows us to think about our biggest, boldest visions for how we want our world to be. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Let's see what folks are saying. I love this. U.S. abolishes ICE. Biden puts a permanent end to family detention. I know that's something that you all are working on. Biden admin exceeds promises. End of child and family detention. Congress authorizes reparations for Black Americans, which I also know you all are working on. Excellent. Great. Keep going with those because I think that it's we often hear that we should not have these big visions, that we have to be really incremental. And I think it's important for us to really claim what it is that we want to see in the world. So thank you for that. And I love seeing what we're putting out there and manifesting. Okay. So I wanted to just start the conversation on social change ecosystems by sort of, getting on the same page about what social change is. And I think you all already know this, but social change happens in so many different ways, right? There are different strategies and ways in which we practice it. So it could be centering community needs. It could be about figuring out what our sacred values are, how we identify root causes of oppression and trauma through history, how we utilize different strategies to get to where we want to go, and how we focus on creating systems change, not just individual change. So these are just some ways in which folks engage in social change as individuals and organizations. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that we are engaging in social change right now at a very, very challenging moment. And that's not to say that we haven't had challenging moments before. Clearly we have, and many of you have been part of those. But we are living through a time right now where we are seeing overlapping and interconnected crises that are affecting the lives, rights, and bodies of people in all different sectors, backgrounds, and identities. Some of this is on the screen in front of you, the rights on trans people, the attacks on trans people, climate justice, racial injustice, right? These are just some of many of the issues that are calling our attention and calling us to respond. And I think that many of us are also affected by these, but we're also motivated and catalyzed by these crises, right? It seems like this is the moment of urgency, as Dr. King used to say, that we need to actually respond with urgency. And this quote by Arundhati Roy is something that I often turn to understand why it's so important to see these moments as portals, which is what she called them. So she writes, and she was writing about the pandemic here. The pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And so for me, the questions there are, what do we want to carry into this new world? What do we leave behind? Who are we journeying with, right? So there are opportunities, even though we are dealing with all of these external crises. At the same time, I think that we also are meeting these external crises with some level of exhaustion and burnout. And I don't know if that resonates with you all. I know I feel it often in my body and in my psyche. But this is an image that we often use to represent what is happening, particularly in nonprofit organizations and movement spaces, where you see here a stove with burners that are turned all the way up often. And sometimes it feels like this inside of our organizations, inside of our coalitions and our movements. And the burners here have different names associated with them. So sometimes we feel like we're in an unending cycle of crisis. At other times, we feel like we just don't have enough to meet these crises in an effective way. We don't have enough finances, partnerships, or people. Many of us, especially those who are affected by the external crises that are happening, are carrying a lot of direct trauma or vicarious trauma, intergenerational trauma as we do this work. And finally, there are a lot of dynamics around dominant culture that affect us as well. We are oftentimes put in situations where we have to compete with one another, particularly because of the way that philanthropy is set up. Or we are engaging in gatekeeping information or hoarding information, or we're constantly taught that we have to perform and produce in order to be seen as doing valuable work. So both the internal and external dynamics in social change work right now can oftentimes make us feel like we're on the seesaw of, either being really outraged or really numb, or that we're never really hitting the nail on the head. Our programs and our activities and our campaigns are just not having the success that we want. We feel oftentimes that we ourselves are cracking, that there is no way that we can continue to sustain our mental health if we are to do this work, or that we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. We deal with one crisis and another one rears its head almost immediately. So I want to pause because I know I've kind of shared a lot about both the possibilities of this time, the realities of this time, both internally and externally, and just wanted to ask you if you could just share any reflections based on what you saw, whether it was an image that spoke to you, whether it was a phrase that I mentioned or a quote, and how you're kind of resonating with that. How is it landing in your body? How are you responding to it? So I'm just going to give us a minute to do that. Yeah, Satsuki says so many moles to whack. Yes, they're ever present. Patty says cringeworthy. Celeste notes there's a definite oscillation between feeling emotional and feeling numb. Sharon, the gatekeepers are worrisome, often feels like rapid response mode, Catherine says. And Mike, I think speaking for all of us, everyone I know is exhausted. Emily says, the stove image and the mention of intergenerational trauma feels very relevant to me as a Japanese American whose family was incarcerated. It feels like we have to heal the past and the present at the same time. Thank you for sharing that, Emily. I think that's really profound to say that for some folks, there is this sense of doing both and it often seems untenable. Great. Lack of resources and the imbalance of them, Stan says. Yes. So how do we sort of make sense, right, of this moment? How do we develop our capacity as individuals? How do we develop our resilience as organizations, given the dynamics? So obviously, I don't have the answer, right? But I do have an approach that I want to offer with deep humility and also recognizing that it is coming on the shoulders of so many people who have done this work. Many of them are here in this room for so many years. And this is an approach that is also I think resonates with the wisdom of people of color, women of color in particular, who have written about social change in different ways. So I want to lift up some of these themes. So Nikki Giovanni on the far right has written, if you don't understand yourself, you don't understand anybody else. And I think that's like a vital part of doing social change work, from the individual to the collective in a way. So we'll talk a little bit about how this approach can help us deepen our own self-awareness. Grace Lee Boggs, our own, has said, in this exquisitely connected world, it is never a question of critical mass. It is always about critical connections. And what she meant by that is that it's always about the relationships and how we build them, how we weave them together, how we return to them, even when we are exhausted and distraught, and how we move through them. And bell hooks, one of the most vital ways we sustain ourselves is by building communities of resistance, places where we know we are not alone. And that really speaks to this idea of ecosystems of social change that are interconnected and intertwined. So some of these themes I think you will find as you work through Social Change Now, the book, as well as this approach, because they're embedded into this framework. And this is something that I developed in 2017 at a time when I myself was on that seesaw almost all the time. And it was, as you probably remember, a time when we were contending with the Muslim ban, when we were seeing children being separated from their families. And I was caught up in these crises. And I was also personally at the time, somebody who had left a leadership role as an executive director of an organization that I had helped to start. And so I was extremely confused about, do I have a role? How do I fit into this? How do I support? So those reflections led me to come up with this framework, which has gone through a couple of iterations because it's been practiced and used over the last 4 years. So this current iteration has 3 components to it. I'll go through them really quickly. The middle circle, the yellow one, is where we identify our sacred and shared values. These are the ones that were speaking to me when I put this map together, but you would have others that you would want to add here. The second part of this framework are 10 roles that we are invited to play and that we often play as individuals and organizations in doing social change. And I'll get into these in a minute. And finally, the entire framework, as you can likely see by the ways that the circles and the lines are interconnecting, tells us that we are part of ecosystems, that when we can support each other in playing these roles, and when these roles are played with capacity and robustness and joy, that we are going to be able to promote the values and goals that we care about. So a few characteristics about this framework that I wanted to lift up. So one of the key things is that this is really about systems change work. Yes, we could grow using this framework as individuals, but it's really about what are we growing in service to change what. It's also a framework that aligns with our skills and strengths. As you look at this, you're probably already thinking, oh, I kind of see myself as a storyteller because I have these skills around that. And so it's really also about developing the capacity, the competence to do this work well. This framework emphasizes sustainability and well-being. And so we can often think about situations where if you work with this, you might find, you know what, I'm playing 8 out of 10 roles, and maybe that's why I'm exhausted. Or I might be playing certain roles and I don't have any support from others in my ecosystem. Or like me, I was a frontline responder for 15 years of my social change journey and realized that it was taking a toll on me. And instead of leaving the ecosystem altogether, I decided to shift to play the role of a guide where I support other frontline responders, but I don't have to leave because I love the community and the work. And lastly, this is a multidimensional framework. So you can use it as an individual, volunteer, staff, board member, but you can also use it as an organization to map out the roles that your staff might be playing. And you can use it as a coalition or a movement to look at the different roles played by organizational members within your coalition. And that can lead you to a lot of insights. There are lots of prompts in the workbook that will help folks think about the insights that you're having, and I'll give you some later as well that you can be thinking about yourself. So a couple of more slides and then I will stop talking and you will get to engage. So on the values in the middle, I think that Tsuru is really clear about your values organizationally. But this is really an opportunity to not just write the words solidarity, which is like a buzzword, right? That's the word I use all the time because I run a project on solidarity. But it's an opportunity to ask, what does that mean in real life? What will it look like in the world when solidarity is achieved, right? So really getting deeper into thinking about not just the phrase, but thinking about what the actual phrase means in reality and in messaging. And now I just wanted to quickly move through the different roles, and I'm just going to talk about these quickly. You can find them in the workbook, and also you can find them on our website, buildingmovement.org. So weavers are the ones that connect the dots between ideas and places and organizations. I think Tsuru does an amazing job of being a weaver to say issues of detention happening today are connected to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and making those connections. Experimenters are those of us who innovate and invent. We take risks. We don't go with the status quo that, oh, this is how it's always been done. We actually find ways to change our strategies depending on the context. Frontline responders, pretty understandable here. We're the ones who address a community crisis. If something happens, we know how to organize everyone else. We know how to figure out what the messaging is. We have a muscle for rapid response. Visionaries, you're all visionaries because we came up with those big visions earlier, but visionaries are the ones who see the North Star. This is where we're going, and they inspire us to get there. And as with many of the roles in this framework, they're complementary. So visionaries can't really get there unless they're working closely with builders. Builders are those of us who actually create the scaffolding between our reality and that North Star. So there are lots of builders in nonprofit spaces, especially. We're the ones who put together the programs and we implement the different events, et cetera. Caregivers and healers are similar, but also different. So caregivers are really focused on their immediate circle of community. That could be the community members who come to our organization for our services. That could be our staff. So they're focused on nurturing the relationships of the people that they know. Whereas healers are those who are having kind of a higher level understanding of how trauma winds itself through generations and people. And they are focused on modes of healing, whether it's somatic or whether it is restorative justice circles. And I think Tsuru does this work as well. Disruptors. Disruptors are those of us who get into good trouble, as Representative John Lewis asked us to do. We are the ones who take uncomfortable and risky actions that often make others uncomfortable. It's a pretty visible role to be a disruptor, but you can also be a quiet disruptor in different ways by asking the question on everyone's minds that no one has the courage to do. So disruptors are a really critical, vital part of any social change ecosystem. Storytellers. Storytellers are those who are crafting and sharing our stories and cultures and experiences in different ways, especially those that have been rendered invisible. And finally, guides. Guides are those of us who have played another role on the map and have gained some wisdom and discernment with that and are able to teach and mentor others. Okay. And then the final aspect, so we talked about values, roles, and finally the ecosystem component of this framework. And when I mention ecosystem, I often think about ecosystems in nature, our own bodies, and there are some characteristics that wind themselves through that I think could be applied to social change ecosystems as well. So there's often a shared energy source that for social change groups is really a set of shared values. There is this real emphasis on reciprocity rather than that gatekeeping and hoarding. There's the ability to be nimble and flexible when change occurs. There's an emphasis on diversity of viewpoint and relationships, the preservation of relationships, and a focus on interdependence and well-being. So we could take a lot of what we see in nature and actually apply it to the ecosystems that we are part of in social change. So as individuals, this framework can help you to get clear about your own values and to understand what happens when your values don't align with your organizational values. It can help you figure out the roles that you want to play or aspire to play that will bring out your highest and best self. And it will help you figure out what can keep you doing this work for the long run. And for organizations and institutions, this can be an opportunity to map out your staff or your coalition and to understand what the characteristics are of that ecosystem. Organizations have used this to think about how sometimes in a coalition, most organizations are redundant. They're playing like the same role over and over. And it can help a coalition really expand itself and be more diverse. And it can move us out of silos and into solidarity spaces. So some examples of how this work is being used right now is organizations like, say, a philanthropic institution can use this framework to map out its grantees to understand where the gaps are and where it needs to do some more grant making. Or a movement like, say, an immigrant rights movement can use this map to map out the different organizations that are doing the work within that movement and to understand what the connections are, or whether all the groups are siloed, just in their own lanes without a sense of we're all on the same highway. So those are just some ways in which organizations can use this. So I'm going to stop now because I think, yes, we're at a point where we can do some back and forth sharing. So before I do that, are there any questions or clarifications before we send folks into breakouts? I'm going to actually stop my share for a minute and see, so I can see you all. Any questions or clarifications or any reflections coming up, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to speak before we do the breakout.
Oh, hello. I
Yoshina?
had a
Yeah.
question.
Go ahead.
I would imagine that some roles might be more common than others, but I was just wondering if there is like a common ratio of roles you see in successful organizations. And I'm sure it differs in every org, but
I think that's a great question. So if in an organization, like when you think about the staff, right? Is that what you're saying? Like, yeah. So, it's not to say that we have to have every single role filled on our staff or our team. It's often hard to do that, but it is important that we actually think about making sure that we do have folks who are visionaries who can actually remind us of why we're doing the work, right? It's really important to have builders, and there usually are lots of builders anyway. They gravitate towards nonprofit spaces, and they're the ones who are actually turning that vision into reality. I'm sorry, I'm looking up because I'm looking at the map myself. It's on my wall. I think that it's important to have storytellers who are usually the ones who can take our work and translate it into the audience and the general public, right? And one of the roles that I often find doesn't exist in most organizations, I don't think you all are like this though, is caregivers and healers. So these are roles that oftentimes don't exist within organizations, or if they do, the caregiver role is oftentimes played by people of color, particularly women of color. So it's also an opportunity to think about. I was recently working with a group where there was like a gender imbalance, where all the men in the organization actually saw themselves as visionaries and experimenters, and the women actually ended up mapping out as caregivers and builders. And the organization itself figured that out. They were like, what's going on here, right? And it was an opportunity for them to reflect on that and also think about how to create more space how can the visionaries and the experimenters create more space for others to kind of come in and play those roles as well? How do they step out or share space? So those are some reflections that can happen. But in answer to your question, I think the ones that I mentioned first are the ones that it would be important and vital for a social change organization to have.
Thank you. Your example was very like, wow, but no, not like in a condescending way, but I'm sure it happens in many places. So
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it just needs to be said and seen visually. And then people are like, oh, okay. Because people are well-meaning and want to shift if they can. Other thoughts or questions, clarifications? Mike?
Yeah, this helped me understand something about the role. I think a lot of us play a number of these roles, but it made me stop to think about, in different times at different spaces, you need to understand that your role, you can limit your role to, specify or shift depending on the circumstance. I don't think I think about that. And I'm going to now.
That's great. And that's such a good insight, Mike, because it's true that context also determines role. And there are times when we are called upon to do something. Like I felt that in the wake of 9/11, I was called upon by my community to be a frontline responder. I don't think that I was necessarily like primed to do it or even wanted to do it, but it felt like at that moment, that was the role that I needed to play. But over time, right, like recognizing, well, I don't have to show up like that all the time in every meeting or in every campaign. So part of this is taking the pause. And I try to do that now before I even go into meetings. I actually try to think, okay, what role am I showing up as? And how can I make that clear to myself and to others so that I'm not always seen as like the visionary person, right? So how do I actually change that up? So it can, just knowing it, that self-awareness, I think can help us figure out how we can show up in the best way for ourselves and for the rest of the ecosystem. Okay, Catherine asks, how do you think about caring for and building and retaining membership in an organization? Yeah, so, when we have organizations that are actually comprised of not just staff, but also members, right, community members, I think that this framework could be useful in engaging and dialoguing with community members about, one, what they see the organization's role is to them, vis-a-vis them. Like, what is the accountability of the organization? How does the organization show up? What do they want from the organization? And often when I do this workshop, the organization will have its own idea of the role it plays, but the members have a completely different idea about the role they want the organization to play. And so even kind of surfacing that can be helpful in doing their retention. And then the second part I would say is, you talked about care. So, this is, again, one of the things that I see often, that caregiving or healing is not necessarily ingrained in an organization's mission or values, but it's vital if we're doing social change work now, especially given all of the crises that we're dealing with and that pressure cooker image, right? So it is an opportunity to also think about how that healing and caregiving happens with the members as well. So I hope I understood your question and responded appropriately. Any other questions?
oh, I see Becca.
Okay, thank you.
Go
I
ahead.
can't see
I've
it
seen
on
your
my
hand
screen,
raised.
so please go ahead and call on people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you talked a little bit about this in response to Mike's question, but like, how do you see this as like the places that we like maybe as individuals like show up more generally, but also have the capacity to play other roles, right? And I think in particular, what you were saying about the kind of like race and gender and ways that we like have been expected to show up, to care for others or play particular roles in society and not others. How do you see that as connected to this and building like our own leadership and to step into like a role that we, like, for example, visionary, that we might not have been kind of
Yeah.
trained to step into, but it actually makes a lot of sense for us to, in certain moments, to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Becca. So I think that you're right. Like, we're conditioned to play certain roles or to respond to calls and requests to play certain roles, right? And that doesn't always serve us. It can in some contexts, and it might not in others. And so if we are aspiring to play a different role than the one that we have always played, I think one of the first things to do is to actually get clear about that within ourselves. And then the second thing to do is to seek out guides. Because if we want to say step into the role of a visionary, we can talk to guides who have played that role before and actually ask questions, right? And this is where I find guides who are coaches to be so helpful, because we can often say, what was your trajectory and how did you do that? And what advice might you have for me? So that is often helpful. A third realization is that we can't always step into the role we want in a particular context, right? Because like, I might want to be a visionary, but I might be somebody, and Nora mentions this here about a hierarchy. I might be the entry-level person in an organization, and it's not going to be possible for me to play the role of a visionary, even if I want to, right? And so identifying that there might be other contexts outside of your organization where you can start flexing that muscle and playing that role. That it might not happen in the ecosystem you're in day to day, but it might be an opportunity to flex those roles elsewhere. So that's why I talk a lot about this being skills-based and strengths-based. One quick example I'll share is that I recently did a workshop with an organization where one of the staff members said, I see I'm a builder, but I actually really am drawn to healing. And one of the things that we talked about was how she can ask the organization to send her to professional development courses or healing workshops, right? Where she's actually building the strengths and the skills, because she also recognized that just wanting it doesn't mean that she can play it. So guides, getting the skills necessary, and even thinking about flexing them in a different ecosystem if you need to. And to Nora's point, yes, it is true that in this particular framework, there is no hierarchy. It is also true that, so everyone does have an important part to play, yes, but it is also true that the nonprofit sector is, for the most part, a hierarchical sector, right? It is based on that kind of Western form of leadership. And so I think it's important to recognize that this framework is a bit disruptive in nature, and it requires us to think about what it means. I'm not saying that we should all be consensus-based. I don't think it always works for a lot of groups. So how do we still try to ensure that everyone plays an important role, even if we are set up in a way that we have got people in leadership and people in middle and people who are entry? I think it stretches an organization to think about it. All right. So
I think Satsuki had
oh,
her hand
sure.
raised. Go
Hi.
ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment. I feel like titling these roles can be so helpful. I mean, I could just imagine having a gathering of people and asking them what are their aspirational roles, as well as what are the skills that they have for different roles that they haven't been invited or had the ability to share. So it's very rich, and I could see even being able to have a conversation to say, I've been in this role from the beginning, but now I'm feeling like I need to shift. And then people would understand when we have these categories. So thank you for that. I think I can just see lots of ways that we could use this to enrich, the way in which people contribute their skills and their dreams too.
That means so much to hear that from you, Satsuki. Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah, great question. Great insights in the chat. We often have disconnects about how we feel about our roles and vis-a-vis how people engage with us. Absolutely. So often that is another question. How do others see us? How do other organizations see us? Stan says, might be good to ask others. Oh, it's the same question. Yeah, it might be different than what you think of yourself. Yeah, you're on the same page as Mike. Okay, so I'm going to ask Mika if we have time for a short breakout.
We absolutely do. So I can go ahead and create those rooms. I think
Oh, let me.
everyone will- oh, do you want to do that?
No, I was just going to put the questions up on the
Okay.
screen. So when you go into breakout, if you could discuss first, or you could think about what role that you most often play to advance social change within Tsuru, if you want to do it that way. And then you can have a short group discussion. And some of the prompts that I'm offering, you don't have to follow these. We'll put them into the broadcast as well. What do you need to thrive and sustain yourself in this role? And what about your organization? What role does it play to advance equity and justice? So these are just some suggestions for the prompts. I'll put those into the chat. Go ahead, Mika.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I believe that Zoom will invite you into the room automatically and send you off into the ether. But if not, or if it doesn't work out, we'll make sure that everyone can get where they're trying to go. So wait for the prompt in just a moment. And if you're not seeing a prompt, it might be down in your toolbar on Zoom, and it will give you a room to enter into. You click on more and breakout rooms.
Can I stay here? I don't know if I'm assigned to a room. Maybe because I'm co. I'll join one that has less people.
Okay.
I'll put the questions into the chat. Hopefully those went through the
I
questions.
think so. I think so.
Okay, I don't see them on mine, but I think they did.
Yes, I'm
Question
seeing
for
them.
you, how long are we giving? I'm so confused. I think I made the mistake of maybe going too long in my thing.
Yeah, the Q&A session ended up being very rich. But I think that will still work. Maybe
Okay. Let them go
Um,
till 1, because I was supposed to be with you till how long? Till 1:30, right?
right. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So why don't we come back at 1:30, and we don't have to do a debrief. I think we could just maybe tell people. So I would say let's bring them back at 1:28. I just want to stay on track for you. And then when they come back, we could just ask people to share a highlight in the chat.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to, I know that you have a time frame. So I could stay on till 1:40 is the latest I could stay on my time. So if you want to do that, we can. Otherwise, we can just try to close like by 1:30, the way that you needed.
Oh no, this will be great. Really, our main concern is your time.
Oh,
Technically, we set this event until what time is it? Until 2, because we just had a couple of we wanted to advertise the workshops and stuff afterwards.
okay.
So if you're able to
then-
stay to 1:40, that would be awesome.
Okay, yeah. So let's bring them back at 1:30. Let's do a 5-minute debrief, where I'll ask how many groups are there? 4, right? So I'll ask each group to share one highlight, and then I have a couple of closing slides that I'll show. And so I should be done by 1:40.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Mhm. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Mika. What time do you have on your clock? Is it 1:30 for you?
I have 127.
Oh, okay. Great. So
Did I go ahead and give them a couple minute warning?
yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
But
Should we bring folks back?
yes, I just sent out the alert, so people
Okay.
should be filtering in and the rooms will close.
Okay,
In a
thank
couple
you.
seconds.
I accidentally hit go back.
Oh, that's okay. You're right on time, Patty.
I mean, I know, but they were just about to talk and it's like, oh, I'll miss it. It's okay. They're great people. Thank you very much, Deepa, for today. I wish my whole group, we're a very collaborative small group, and we are so adept at respecting and understanding each other's strengths, whatever, and we work to those. So just to say, I really appreciate
Oh, good.
Matrix. It's really great. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hello, welcome back. I know it's never enough time. have the conversation, but I hope it was like a little teaser and that you will find time to maybe do a deeper dive into these prompts and the many, many prompts that are in the journal workbook as well as you move forward. But just wanted to take a little time now to maybe get one highlight from each of your groups. So it could be a theme that kept coming up. It could be a question that came up that you all were like, So let's see what emerged. And I should have said that someone should be in charge of speaking. And I apologize, I forgot to give that instruction. But we all have done this many times. I'm sure someone will volunteer. So let's go with room 4. Is there somebody who can share a highlight or theme either in the chat or into the space with us? So that was Annette, Mike, Patty, Shoshana, and Michael Tanaka.
I talk all the time, so why don't we ask Patty? Where's Patty?
No, actually, you should ask Mikey. I know you talk all the time, or Michael, because I accidentally left early. How about you, Michael?
You guys, you're not being fair to Mike.
Okay, I will pick someone. I don't see, okay, how about Michael? Would you share one theme that came up in your conversation?
Yeah, so we largely just talked about the kind of connection between like capacities of nonprofit organizations and our kind of willingness to like step into like different roles, but also like as social change organizations that do lack capacity, how do we best be adaptable but also think of like our own energy too? Are we overextending ourselves, and
Right.
in what ways are we also coming back to ourselves as well? I think it's largely a matter of like introspectiveness when it comes to our own capabilities, but at the same time it can it really should be framed as an empowering stance that yes, like we can play everything that we need to for our organization, and it's just a matter of stepping up sometimes.
Thank you for sharing that. What about room 3? That was Becca, Ellen, Anna, and Scott Hasagawa, Emily, and Mika.
Yeah, I can share for our group. I think that we touched upon the question or the theme of like how to sustain the roles, or at least the work that we're doing in each role. And a common theme that came up was having connections with others, whether that be in the relationships that we build with the peers who are doing work with us or in similar spheres, or also having connections to resources, information, and whatnot. So access and I guess ability to reach out for help when needed is as well.
Yeah, asking for that support is oftentimes something we don't do, not trained or conditioned to do, but it's vital if we're working with others. Okay, room 2, that was Celeste, Janice, Stan, Susan, and Yang. Who might be willing to share a highlight?
I can share. Yeah, our group was great. It was a good mix of some people who have a lot of experience with thinking in terms of these roles, and then others of us who are just new to them. I think a common theme that I kind of felt or picked up on was maybe some of the I would say frustrations of being in certain roles, such as sometimes the downsides or the struggles of being in a builder role and feeling both siloed and also at times even unappreciated when your work becomes kind of invisible. And then also, the struggles of feeling like you've been in a certain role for so long and that you should, be aspiring to other roles more, but maybe being not quite sure how to do that given time, or just trying to respond to what's always happening. So that was,
that's great. Yeah, and I think that it's such a good point where you talked about value and whether people feel valued or seen in terms of the roles that they play, not just like the outcomes, right, and deliverables. And I think for those of us who are supervisors, or directors, right? This can be an important way of actually appreciating people, to say, you know, I see how you kind of leaned into that storyteller role, and in terms of what you did, right? And so I think it can help us do that appreciation of the person and the role rather than the deliverable. Okay, and then finally, Betsy, Satsuki, Sharon, and Yoshino. Can someone share a theme that emerged in your conversation?
Okay, I'm happy to. I feel like I've been taking up so much space, but I think one thing I got out of it was how really like context-based our roles are. And I think we touched on how there's a lot of like intersectional elements to this. I know you mentioned that how like women are often caregivers, you know, like elders are often taking guide roles. And so just like opening up space for more people to take up roles. And then I think other things we touched on were, you know, how sometimes the struggle of, you know, like you think you have allies, but they not necessarily betray you, but they don't like hold up to their words, you know. I feel like that's also definitely something that happens in this space sometimes. So
yeah, there's a lot of like movement heartbreak that happens in our spaces, and a lot of that does come down to, I think, a lack of accountability and a lack of clarity sometimes. And so this could be a way, there are many ways, a way of kind of getting clear on what people's roles are, but also like what's expected of them. And the only other thing I'll quickly say is that often, you know, I encourage coalitions to think about bringing healers into spaces from the beginning, rather than when a conflict emerges, which is always inevitable, and then there are like hurt feelings. And so how do we engage healers from the start of a coalition to set the container, to set our community agreements, and to actually be ready, right? All of us be ready for things to be heartbroken, to have something happen that we didn't anticipate, and then feel like, oh, okay, this isn't working. So how do we turn conflict, or discern when conflict is generative and can be generative to us? Great. So let me just check the chat. And yes, Stan, agree with what you're saying, that the builder role is invisible until something goes wrong. That is correct. And I just wanted to say that in the book, if you have a chance to work through it, there's a chapter on every role which identifies characteristics much deeper than what I had shared with you, but also has a room to grow section. So what are the ways in which we can get into our highest self if we're playing this role? And then there are prompts to help us kind of think about some of the ways in which we can strengthen our role and ask for support from others. And then there's also a section on organizations playing the role. So you might be able to get a lot more out of it if you work through it. So I have just a couple of quick slides and then I will let you go. So let's see here. Yeah, so just kind of, you know, I love this image and what it says. It's another Grace Lee Boggs quote: the way to survive, the only way to survive is by taking care of each other. And then how to use this framework. So you can use it for your own personal development. You can use it to identify a campaign strategy that involves a lot of stakeholders. You can use it as part of staff meetings or retreats. You can use it, as organizations have, as part of strategic planning to say, okay, for the next 3 years, we are going to show up primarily as a storyteller, and this is how. You can use it to figure out fundraising objectives and get more clear on what you're raising money for. With members and community members in particular, doing workshops for storytelling and narrative. So there are lots of ways in which folks are using this framework in terms of understanding each other, themselves, and strengthening their social change ecosystems. And this is where you can find more. The hub for this framework is at socialchangemap.com, and where you'll find a lot more information like podcasts and Instagram lives that explain this framework. My handles are here. And our solidarityis.org website is also here. And the Asian American report I mentioned, which I know Mike has a copy of this, is on buildingmovement.org. So let me stop my video and, not stop my video, stop the share, and just turn it back over to you, Mika.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Deepa. And I know that you actually have another obligation that you need to get to, so we'll make sure to let you get there. But if we could all give our thanks to Deepa, that would be really, really wonderful. Thank you all so much for your engagement. We have a couple of brief announcements with regard to where we want to take this work next and some of Tsuru's current projects we want to uplift. So if you could stick around, that would be excellent. But we will let Deepa move into her next engagement for today.
Thank you. And you're also a co-host, right? So when I leave, it's not going to end. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for your work. Look forward to collaborating. Bye.
Thank you, Deepa.
Okay, as we wrap up this event, thank you all so much for coming. I'm gonna post the links to purchase books, but I think Deepa told us it's sold out right now, so it's gonna come back in like 2 weeks. I think the middle link, small press distribution, has stock right now, but I think it's gonna come back on Amazon in 2 weeks. Is that right, Mika? She said 2 weeks. And then just a reminder, we also have 2 more workshops coming up in April. And so we'll actually work through what Deepa has touched on today. So we'll work through the reflective exercises in our books. And then I think it'll just be a fun time to just reflect, journal, and talk. And then the first workshop is the first half of the book, and the second one is the second half of the book. But even if you can only make one, we still encourage you to come. We welcome everyone. So yeah, and then Mike said small press is also sold out. Thank you, Mike. It should come back in 2 weeks, but if you don't have the book, we can still work through the activities, so do not worry. And then one last thing, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, but a few weeks ago we found out Biden's considering reinstating a family detention policy, and we're absolutely disgusted to hear this. As an org who really still feels the long-lasting harms of family detention. And so, as we know, this administration continues to fail immigrant and migrant communities. And, he campaigned to end this in 2020, and now 3 years later, we're moving backwards. So this is really unacceptable. And so our closing ask today is for you to, let me post it in the chat, but visit this link, do what you can in your capacity, sign the petition, and help us end family detention. But I think that's it. And thank you all so much for joining. And I hope you have a good rest of your Sunday. Anything else, Mika? Did I miss anything?
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Yoshino. And we did want to emphasize that even if you don't have a chance to get your book, please do join us for these workshops. It'll be an opportunity for us to have engaged conversations in an intimate setting and to work through thinking through not only our roles, and the roles of those around us, but also these roles at the level of organizations and movements. And we really look forward to seeing you again. And if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday to sit with us today, and have an excellent rest of your weekend.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Will I end it here, you guys?
Yeah, let's do it.
Bye, thank you for coming.
Bye, Sharon. Thank you.